So this is the beginning of AP Macroeconomics, and we're going to start in the textbook in section 2.2 that deals with circular flows. Even though we'll define the term later on, the gross domestic product, which is the value of all final goods and services that a country produces, so it deals with production. The circular flow model is used to illustrate GDP. It's going to show the flow of expenditures and also the flow of incomes between households and businesses. So the question is, what is a market? Well, a market does not have to be a physical place, like a grocery store. It could be eBay. So a market is just some type of an arrangement where buyers and sellers can come together and interact. So there are two different types of markets. There's a factor market and a product market. A factor market deals with the factors of production. So the factors of production are land, labor, and capital, and the factor of productions are bought and sold. So factor markets are markets in which the factors of production which are land, labor, and capital, are bought and sold. And a product market, this is sometimes called a goods market, but a product market is for goods and services, and this is a market where goods and services are bought and sold. So we have two types of flows in the circular flow model. There are real flows and money flows. Of course, the flow of money is what you would think. It's money that's exchanged between the two groups. And the real flows, these are flows such as the flow of labor, the flow of capital between the groups. And in factor markets, households, the individuals, they are the owners of the factors of production. For example, workers own their labor, so they supply the factors of production, and firms, in this case, are the ones who hire or demand the factors of production. The goods market or the product market is the market we typically think about, and here it's where firms are the ones who are supplying the goods and services, and where, so I'm using my finger, and where households are the ones who buy goods and services. They are the demanders of those goods and services. So as I mentioned, there are both real flows and money flows. We're going to first look at the real flows. So these are the flows of the land, labor, and capital, the goods that go between the two different groups. So we have the households and the firms, and then we have the goods market. Once again, you can think of the goods market as the product market. This is the product for goods and services. So you can think there's a supply and demand curves. So this is where the firms and the households come together where the goods are bought and sold. So for the real flows, the question is, which way do the real flows go? Would the arrows go clockwise or counterclockwise? Give you a minute to think about that. If you need to stop the video, you can. Let's think about the flows of goods and services. Will firms, of course, are making goods and services. They're going to be putting them up for sale in the product market. Of course, households and individuals come to the product market. If they like those goods and services, they purchase them. So therefore, the flow of goods and services goes away from the firms to the store and then to the households. What's leaving the households and going to the factor market? Well, it's the factors of production. So you can think we have a labor market, so perhaps the demand for labor and the supply for labor. So the individuals are offering their land, labor, and capital for sale. They put that for sale in the factor market. The firms go and they purchase that land, labor, and capital. They use those factors of production to produce goods, and hence we can see that arrow continues. So that direction is the real flow, and the way this is situated, these boxes could be turned around of course, but the way this is situated, the real flow is counterclockwise. And at the bottom the question asks, what is the money flow? Well, the money flow is going to be the opposite direction. Should make sense. So if the firms are going to be buying the goods and services, well, the firms, what do they have to do? They have to spend money. That's the money flow. Money's going to leave the households, go to the stores. The stores, of course, then are going to give that money to the firms. What do the firms do with some of the money they have? Well, the firms are going to buy the land, labor, and capital, so money is going to leave the firms, go to the factor market, and of course when land, labor, and capital are purchased by the firms, the money is going to go to the households. So you can see in this model, the last arrows we drew, which are clockwise, the way this diagram is situated, is the money flow, and counterclockwise is the real flow. I wouldn't try to memorize this. I would just use, hopefully, what is common sense to figure it out. And this page shows a more detailed breakdown for that. So they actually do it where the money flow is on the outside. So you could look at the households at the top and what's going on. Well, the households are spending money, so money is leaving the households, going to the product market, and of course which way the products are going to the opposite direction. So that's the real flow. And you could look at all sides of this and see on the opposite sides. Should make sense that if, for example, the factor market, the land, labor, and capital that is being purchased by the firms, being supplied by the individuals, what's going to happen is the money. What are the payments for land, labor, and capital? It's the rent, the wages, and interest. So that money is going to be going to the households, which is the top arrow in this case, and the bottom is the real flow. The land, labor, and capital the households own are going to the factors. So across all these arrows, this is what is exchanged. If goods and services are supplied, then the firms are going to receive the revenue, and so too here. If the businesses are getting the land, labor, and capital, then of course some of that money has to go away from them. So the question is, how can we make this a more complicated circular flow? This is a very, very basic circular flow. Just to point out, of course, the money flows and the real flows are going in the opposite directions. So things that are not included, this model that could be included, more complicated models. Of course, we know there's government. The government is going to be taking money away from both businesses and individuals, but the money also transfer some of those payments back to businesses and individuals. Other things we could look at is savings. People obviously save some money, put some money in banks. That's not represented here. And also there is trade, so there are exports and imports, and that's not reflected in this simplified circular flow. So here's an example where government has been added to the mix. So we have government is just stuck in the middle. So of course what happens, we know households are paying taxes, so money is leaving the households, going to the government, but then it's called transfers. So the government also sends money away from the government to some individuals. So these kind of transfer payments, you can think about as maybe unemployment compensation, Social Security, things along that nature. And also the same token, firms or businesses, they pay taxes, so the money is going away from the firms to the governments, but the government also gives transfer payments to corporations. You can think of this perhaps as a subsidy. And then if you notice here in the government, there's another arrow that goes so away from the government, 3 directions: transfers to the households, transfer to the firms, but also the government, right, is buying things. They're spending money in goods and services. They're maybe building roads, building bridges. They have to hire contractors. They produce reports, IRS, they have to buy paper, etc. And therefore money is going also to the good market for that reason as well. Okay, so there are some what's called leakages and injections. So in the circular flow, the leakage would be savings is also involved, imports, and injections which stimulate the economy would be exports, as well, and perhaps borrowing. And at the bottom, name different types of transfer payments the government gives to households to firms, and that was previously addressed in the form of unemployment benefits, Social Security, subsidies, etc. You do not have to, needless to say, memorize this, but this is estimated because fiscal year 2015 really wasn't over, at least in my recording of this video. So this is the estimated federal government spending for the U.S. and also their total revenue, where they get their sources of income. So as you can see, the U.S. federal government in 2015 estimated to have spent $3.9 trillion, and they took in $3.34 trillion. So like any family, if you spend more than you take in, revenue is income, then you have a deficit we'll look at. So the government has more spending than they do have income coming in, so there is a deficit, and we'll address that later on. Just looking at these categories, they can be combined differently, so you can get different feels for what's going on. But if you just look at the big expenditures, so healthcare is a huge expense, as we know. Country, we have good healthcare outcomes for most people at least. Well, healthcare is a large part of the budget. National defense is a very, very large share of the budget. Pensions, so these are federal workers, a lot of workers of the government, so the type things involved is also large. Interest on the debt, this is actually going to be a growing percent of the budget as we obviously have additional debt and have to borrow more money. So those are the main aspects of federal government spending. The question is, where does the government get its income, its revenues? Or I should say taxes. Well, there's the big tax, of course, is income taxes on individuals. Then, of course, there's Social Security tax. If you work, you pay part of your income for Social Security tax. Businesses actually match that as well. That's another tax to businesses. Business also pays other type of corporate taxes. And then there is something that's a term you're probably not familiar with, ad valorem taxes, sometimes known as excise taxes. So it's the tax you don't really see, but you pay it. So for example, they call it sin taxes because they're taxed on goods which are bad for your health. So for example, on alcohol, guns, cigarettes, and also on transportation there's a gas tax, also another form of an excise tax, and that's important for the government for the revenue. And those who took micro, looking at the inelasticity of demand, it makes sense actually for the government to tax these goods which have an inelastic demand, because if the price goes up to the form of higher taxation, quantity decreases only a little bit, and therefore government can still get a large amount of income. You can look at these percents. The income taxes are both the individual and corporate taxes, and of that amount that we see, about 40% of the budget, about 3/4 of that is from individuals, and 25% is on businesses. So in 2015, what was the federal deficit expected to be? Well, if we look at the numbers from above, we have 3.34 trillion and 3.9 trillion. It actually was lower than that difference. So if we look at the difference between there, that $560 billion, 0.56 trillion. So that was expected to be, if I did that math correctly, I can't see it above, 560 billion. But it was actually lower than that because the economy got stronger, the government collected more revenue, and also less people were collecting unemployment benefits, so some of those transfer payments were reduced as well. Okay, big topic, and one that's not really known by many people in the US, the difference between a budget deficit and the national debt. Well, in the US, we can look at the numbers, but which is greater? In the US, the national debt is definitely much greater than the budget deficit. The national debt is the sum of all deficits and surpluses. So it's the entire amount of money that is owed. So it's a sum of all the debts, and then you could take away the sum of the surpluses. So we've had many more years of debts where we spent more than we took in than surpluses. I'm sorry, I should say the sum of all the deficits is a better way to classify that. The sum of all the deficits minus the sum of all the surpluses. So what is a budget deficit? A budget deficit is just a 1-year period of time. Unlike the national debt, which is a sum cumulative since our nation's beginning. So it's a 1-year. Deficit is a 1-year situation where your expenditures, which is the amount of money you take in, is greater than your income or your revenue. So as we mentioned above, our expenditures were, I believe, 3.9 trillion. Our revenue, the amount of money the federal government took in, was $3.34 trillion. So in that case, we had a budget deficit. If it was reversed, we'd have a budget surplus. A little aside, Saudi Arabia, this is 2015, they would just announce that they have a budget deficit of $100 billion, which is actually quite large for that country. And we'll talk and the implications to that when we're in class. Okay, I've kind of alluded to this, but here you can see the U.S. federal deficits from 1950 to 2015. These were the expected 2015. And if you can see that it has exploded, the U.S. deficits, federal deficit, 2008, 2011. So questions for you to consider. Why is that? What was happening in that time period where U.S. federal deficits exploded? And then also, after 2011, what were the factors that caused those deficits to decline? And just to be there are also state and local governments that can have and do have deficits and surpluses. So back to U.S. national debt. As stated, our government has borrowed more than we have tax revenue, than we have a national debt. Right? Sum of all deficits minus sum of all surpluses is announced. And as of 12/23/15, when I wrote this, the U.S. national debt was $18.5 trillion, and the federal budget deficit for that 1 year in 2015 was at $442 billion. Of course, since there are 8 more days left to that year, both of those numbers presumably will be a bit higher. I will show you the debt clock, which is referenced here as an interesting link. And below, just to look at this, we'll go into more detail. You can see top portion left to right hand side, and then bottom portion of these two graphs. Left to right, so it's the same topic on the top. The deficit surpluses, the small little region right here, those were surpluses. So you can see we haven't had surpluses very infrequently and not very large dollar value. And you can look at our national debt on the left hand side here, and then the national debt. It's the same year, so the question is, notice it says U.S. national debt, and this is true for the deficits and surplus. It says current dollars, and it says in constant 2005 dollars. So we'll go into more detail what that means. But just looking at the graph, the bottom two graphs, these two I'm speaking about. What happens to the increase? Let's take from the year 2000, 2014 or so, what's ever listed. What's happening to this rate of increase compared to that rate of increase? Obviously, it's much greater on the left-hand side than the right-hand side. Well, the question is, what is the difference? One should think about that, and we'll go over that in class. And here's just another graphic I added. This is the U.S. total debt since 1900. Well, you can look at periods where the debt balloons. You should not be surprised with what's happening there in the early 40s in the world. And then we can also look at this increase and what was going on there in the world. And to conclude the lesson out, please do the practice problem 2.2 on page 48 in the textbook. The answer to that is below the page in that textbook.